Hello, Dan Alasso again, Making History, and I want to say something brief about the sources that I've been using in this biography of Dr. Charles Knowlton. So as I've been reading this biography, An Infidel Body Snatcher and the Fruits of His Philosophy aloud, I've been noticing the background information, and I've been reminded of how much background reading I had to do so that I would be able to set the scene accurately and in a way that would allow my readers or listeners to glimpse the world that Knowlton lived in, which really was quite unlike our own in many ways. Now, in some cases, the additional information that I researched had to do with things like physical settings. The central Massachusetts villages where Charles was born, where he met his bride Tabitha and her family, and where he stole corpses and learned from village doctors. These were all very much more remote than they may seem to us today. Most of these places are now just crowded suburbs of Worcester. They were, of course, much less densely populated at the time, and the distances were perceived differently by a person on foot or on horseback. Places like Royalston, where the young medical student stays with a village doctor, along with 4 other students in the summer of 1823, in Chapter 10, which I've just read, had been a frontier settlement within living memory. The elder Dr. Batchelor had arrived there in 1768 and had run away from wolves and bears while on his rounds visiting patients. Now, the sources of stories like this, of the early days of Royalston and of the father and son doctors, Batchelor, were, of course, not part of Knowlton's memoir. In order to fill in these details, I referred to several old texts. Every Massachusetts town has a vital records book that lists all the births and deaths and marriages of residents from the earliest settlement, oftentimes in the late 18th century, to the end of the year 1849. In there, I discovered the ages of the 2 doctors in 1823 when Knowlton stayed with them. And I also discovered that the younger Batchelor had been married 3 times but had no children. And there had also been a genealogical book published in 1898 about the Batchelor family, which contained the passage describing the younger doctor as riding rapidly and smoking as fast. There are a lot of genealogies of Yankee families available through sites like archive.org, the Internet Archive. There's one for the Knowltons, for example, as well as for the Rannys, who I talk about later in the book. These often contain valuable information about these individuals, as well as about the places where they lived. And then there are typically histories of these places themselves, such as Gardner, Massachusetts, where Knowlton was born, or Ashfield, where he later settles, that also provide valuable insights into the details of not only the physical setting that makes up the background of the story, but the history of the place. The fact that Knowlton's grandfather and father, for example, had marched off to defend Boston after the battles of Lexington and Concord are remembered in the local histories. And this also suggests the social standing of the family that Charles was born into. Now, when Knowlton himself traveled to the big city for the first time in his life, in Chapter 7, and visited Boston to sell his buckets, I wanted to try to describe the city as he first encountered it. I found very useful information on the turnpike that he traveled from Templeton to Boston on Wikipedia, actually. And I did use the web to search up old maps of Boston, which had changed a lot, really, between 1822, when Charles first visited it, and even 1833, when he was imprisoned there. In 1822, there were bridges connecting the Shawmut Peninsula to the mainland, but fewer. And the city was much narrower, and was actually much taller, since hills like Pemberton were not leveled to provide fill to expand the mill pond and connect the north end more firmly to the rest of the city until the mid-1830s. And lots of images of the old city are also available on the web. And I have used several of these as the basis of descriptions of the settings that Charles would probably have passed through. Another element of scene setting involves reminding myself and my readers what is going on at the time of the events that I'm describing. The types of medical electrical experiments, for example, that Richard Stuart might have been doing in the late 1810s, and what he had probably read about the experiments of men such as Ben Franklin, Erasmus Darwin, or Joseph Priestley, were based on some research that I did into early electrical machines and into the writings of those early scientists. My strong suspicion that a man such as Stuart, who actually left no records of his own and is mentioned briefly in several local histories as a clever mechanic, or that he might have read such books, this is just circumstantial. But it is based on my understanding of the very, very wide spread of such texts in early New England. And that I derive from the work of historians such as William Gilmore Leaney, who wrote a very useful book called Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life, describing a very extensive study that he had done of estate inventories in the region during the early Republic era. So while I can't claim that Stuart for sure had read these scientific accounts, I can suggest that he may very well might have done so. Finally, I was extremely lucky, of course, that Charles Knowlton wrote a memoir, which his son-in-law, Stephen J.W. Tabor, sent to the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal after Charles's death in 1850. In addition to that memoir, Knowlton wrote quite a bit about particular experiences, too. So I've been able to draw from sources such as his other articles or letters to the Boston Medical Surgical Journal, as well as things like his pamphlet on the recent excitement in Ashfield and his letters to Abner Nealon's Boston Investigator, both during and after his imprisonment in 1833. If I was going to expand on this biography, the thing that I would probably try to add would be comments of his peers, and especially, if I could find them, comments of his detractors. There is, for example, supposedly a diary written by the wife of the minister who persecuted and tried to prosecute Knowlton in Ashfield in the mid to late 1830s. That exists in the archives of Yale University. I haven't been to see it yet, but if I do ever get close to New Haven, I may stop by and take a look. So I'll say more about the sources as the story develops. But in the meantime, I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening. I'll see you again soon.